Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 493, Wired Up. Japan's forceful opening took place at a somewhat fateful time in the history of humanity. The collapse of feudalism and the emergence of a modern imperial nation-state occurred against the backdrop of 19th century industrialization, which has, of course, fundamentally remade the way we as a species live, thanks to the magic of industrial technology and to the perils it can create. But of course, the industrial world is not just about factories, and for the next few weeks, I want to focus on one aspect of that shifting way of modern living, the technology of communication. This is, of course, a very important field. After all, those technologies are the reason you can be listening to my voice anywhere in the world in your magic glowing rectangle of choice. But even before the internet, these technologies were essential for binding ever more complex societies together and shaped what those societies looked like. And that, in turn, is a really important idea for us to think about. If you've ever taken, basically any course in political theory or modern history or anything like that, you've probably been exposed to the ideas of one Benedict Anderson. We've certainly talked about him before. For a quick refresh, Anderson was an academic most famous for his study of modern nationalism entitled Imagined Communities. Anderson's basic thesis is actually all about the role of technology, particularly in his case print media, and the way in which it helped tie people who realistically would never meet each other in their lives together into a single national community by allowing them to share a single common narrative about their world. If that sounds abstract, what Anderson is saying is essentially this. Two people in New York and Texas, or for that matter, say Fukuoka and Sapporo, don't necessarily have anything in common with each other. But if they're both reading the same newspapers, or watching the same nightly news program, or reading the same news blogs, they're getting the same stories about the world they live in and their role in it, and that provides a sense of kinship where there was not necessarily one before. In other words, the shared story provided by mass media is what lets these two people believe they share a common community despite such geographical distances, and believing in that community is in turn what makes it real. Now, Anderson's research was focused very specifically on print journalism, but as Karim Yassar points out in his excellent book Electrified Voices, print is not the only technology with a role to play in these developments. And for the next few weeks, I want to focus on a few of those technologies and the historical circumstances under which they came to Japan, and the ways in which they helped remake the country into what it is today, using Yassar's research as my baseline. And today I want to start with two pieces of technology with tightly intertwined histories, one of which is now largely consigned to the dustbin of history, the other of which is, at least in the view of most of the millennials I know, headed there quite fast. I refer, of course, to the telegraph and the landline telephone. Telegraphs, if you are not familiar, relied on electrified wires to transmit signals back and forth. Those signals can be converted into letters, numbers, and other symbols, and thus used to pass text back and forth rapidly across wide distances. Honestly, the best comparison is probably to modern texting, except reliant on a wired connection instead of wireless transmission. And the core idea here is pretty old. The first mention of it that we know of dates to February 17th, 1753. On that date, an anonymous letter signed only CM was submitted to Scott's Magazine, which is still in circulation, the world's oldest circulating magazine, reporting, as the name implies, on matters of interest to Scottish people. And intermixed in that issue with what I assume were a bunch of articles on treating whiskey hangovers and how to cook haggis, just kidding Scotland, I love you, was a letter from the anonymous CM, suggesting a peculiar idea for a device. The device would have two terminals, with wires moving between them. Each wire would be labeled with a different letter of the alphabet, wire A, B, C, and so on. With enough wires for every letter, and presumably some punctuation and spaces, you could pass text back and forth instantaneously simply by spelling out your message via using the correct wires in the correct order, using a simple friction generator to create the electricity for the signal pulses. It's a pretty neat core concept, built upon the already extant technology of optical telegraphs, using visual signals over long distances, for example, using lanterns and signal fires. That's a technology with its own long history going all the way back to classical antiquity, and of course even farther back to the lighting of the beacons of Gondor, calling the riders of Rohan for aid. From what we know, however, neither CM nor anyone else was able to actually build this newfangled machine, because generating enough electricity to send the pulses any meaningful distance was still an engineering challenge beyond what was possible. It would take until the early 1800s for the technology to develop enough to make telegraphs feasible in any meaningful sense. First, in 1825, the British inventor William Sturgeon invented the electromagnet, the basis of much of modern communication technology. For our purposes, what's useful about electromagnets are that they are far more reactive to electricity than traditional magnets, so the signal does not need to be as strong, increasing its effective range. 5 years later, the American Joseph Henry cracked the distance issue. It turned out that a series of batteries, rather than one big one, could send a signal reliably over a wire more than a mile long. And then finally, in 1835, a professor of design and art at New York University by the name of Samuel Morse began to develop a device that sent electrical pulses along a wire to deflect an electromagnet. The movements of that electromagnet in turn would emboss a series of dots and dashes onto a piece of paper. Morse then worked out a code that would translate those dots and dashes into letters and punctuation, creating a code that would take his name and remain in use, if Star Trek is to be believed at least, well into the 2300s. Morse would continue to refine his system to the point that in 1844, he was able to send a message over 44 miles from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. The message was, if you are wondering, what hath God wrought? And it turned out, God hath wrought a pretty good signaling system. 44 miles is not a huge distance, but it was enough to start setting up relay stations to keep passing messages along, making telegraphs viable for rapid communication. Morse's system was not the first one out of the gate, but it was the one that became the global standard. International treaties eventually spelled out the rules for an international Morse code, and telegraphy was born. By the 1850s, tens of thousands of miles of telegraph wires spanned Europe and the United States, though the technology would remain rare in European and American overseas colonies. And one of the devices brought to the far-flung islands of Japan in 1853 by one Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry was, in fact, a fully functional telegraph with 3 miles of wiring. The official record of the expedition actually recounts attempts to demonstrate it to the Japanese envoys sent to negotiate with Perry, though language barriers and the fact that most of the Americans did not have a good enough grasp on electrical engineering to explain how the damn thing actually worked made the task rather challenging. This was not actually even the first functional telegraph in Japan. 4 years earlier, a Rangaksha, or student of Dutch, that is to say Western learning, by the name of Sakuma Shozan, had built his own functional model telegraph using diagrams from European books he had acquired and translated. Sakuma was an ardent follower of news from outside Japan and had become convinced in the wake of China's disastrous defeat in the First Opium War that a similar fate awaited Japan if it did not adapt modern technology to its own defense. For his troubles, he was assassinated in the 1860s by radical anti-foreign samurai for being too pro-Western. The telegraph remained something of a curiosity to most in Japan for the next few decades. The first Japanese national to actually learn how to use one from a European was Enomoto Takeaki, the man who led the last holdout of the Tokugawa shogunate in Hokkaido, and who would go on to direct that island's colonization for the new government. Before all that went down, he had studied abroad in the Netherlands, and there learned how to operate one of the newfangled machines. But it was Fukuzawa Yukichi, the great intellectual of the early Meiji era, who really brought the idea of the telegraph into public consciousness. His 1866 work Seiyo Jijo, or Conditions in the West, was one of the first popular works written to explain life outside of Japan to a Japanese audience. Written on the basis of notes Fukuzawa took from 1860 to 62, during missions to the United States and Europe, the book was also written in a style closer to vernacular Japanese, making it far more accessible to the average audience than most books on affairs in the West, which were written in a more classical and thus much more difficult style. The first printing sold 150,000 copies, a clear indication of wide-ranging interest in the subject, and the inside cover of that first edition depicted a globe crisscrossed by telegraph wires and steamships. Fukuzawa clearly believed in what this new technology could do. He would later write that, quote, "When we think about the function of the telegraph, we can either say the distance of 1700 ri has been reduced to naught, or that the body of the Japanese nation has been extended to all locales." Since there are also telegraph lines in foreign countries, not only Japan but the entire world will be shrunk and made more manageable. Among those reading Fukuzawa's description of the power of the telegraph were many of the leaders of the new Meiji state. By 1869, the government had already organized a line connecting the port of Yokohama to the national capital at Tokyo, and from there the network expanded rapidly. An Osaka to Kobe line was completed in 1870, Tokyo to Nagasaki by 1873, Tokyo to Aomori in 1874, and Aomori to Hokkaido in 1875. And if you know your Japanese geography, you know that this means within 7 years of the start of the Meiji era, the government had constructed telegraph lines connecting opposite ends of the country. From here, the emphasis shifted to backfill, so to speak, connecting the major cities of the country to the existing skeleton network. This network also plugged Japan into the wider telegraphic system. In 1871, the Danish Great Northern Telegraph Company completed lines connecting Nagasaki to both Vladivostok and Shanghai, and from there on to the rest of the world. And that meant that once Tokyo was connected to Nagasaki in 1873, it was possible to send a telegram from Tokyo to somewhere as far away as London in about 1 day. By comparison, it would take about 2 months to send a letter that far. Now, if you know the Japanese language, you're probably already asking yourself an important question. How exactly do you render Japanese into telegraph form? After all, Japanese makes substantial use of kanji, the ideographic characters borrowed from Chinese. You need thousands of these just to be literate at a basic level in Japanese, but that does not work with Morse-style code, because to render kanji you would need to memorize thousands of dot-dash combinations to transmit them over a telegraph line. In fact, that exact problem cropped up in China. When the Chinese imperial government began setting up its first telegraph lines in 1880, there was no standardized system of Chinese romanization, a way to write Chinese phonetically using Roman letters. The oldest romanization system in use, Wade-Giles, wasn't put into place until 1892. So instead, each character was assigned a numerical value that could then be transmitted via Morse code and then converted back from numbers into characters, a very inefficient system because you had to encode and decode each message twice, first from characters to numbers and then from numbers to Morse code. This made telegraphs both much slower in China than everywhere else, and way more expensive. In Japan, however, the problem was dodged, thanks to the very first thing you learn as a first-year Japanese student. You see, unlike Chinese, Japanese does have a system of phonetic characters. The language is written using a combination of kanji and the phonetic hiragana and katakana scripts. Telegraph messages were simply written entirely phonetically using these kana syllables. That can be very confusing given the number of homophones, or different words with the same pronunciation, that Japanese has, but for basic messages, it was perfectly manageable. However, for the first decade and a half of the telegraph's existence in Japan, the technology had very limited use. Only government and military officials were allowed to make use of the telegraph network. For example, the Kyushu branch of the network provided essential coordination for responding to the Saga and Satsuma samurai rebellions in the 1870s. The earliest telegraph stations were actually set up in areas the Meiji Emperor visited during his early tours of the country, presumably as a way to make sure that the government and the emperor remained connected to goings-on in the capital. It was not until 1885 that a revised telegraph law, promulgated by the Meiji leadership, allowed for civilian use of the telegraph thanks to a government run telegraph network managed by the Taishinsho, or Communications Ministry. Even then, you could use it only at hideously expensive rates. A message of 20 or fewer syllables was 7 sen to send, with a surcharge of between 2 and 5 sen for each station the message had to be relayed through. This was at a time where the average household income was a bit less than 200 yen per year. Outside of wealthy businessmen, very few bothered to send messages via telegram because the postal service was just way cheaper. It was not until the early 20th century that telegraph access became consistently affordable for average people in Japan, but when it did, it kickstarted a process we're going to see pretty consistently across the communication technology we're going to be talking about: the standardization of the Japanese language. As anyone who's ever spent time in the more rural parts of Japan can tell you, local dialects are still a thing in the Japanese language, but they used to be quite a bit stronger and more prevalent. However, one of the things a nationwide communication network requires is some standardization of language. It doesn't matter if you can send a message from Aomori to Tokyo in a matter of minutes. If that message is in an Aomori dialect, nobody in Tokyo can understand. This, of course, meant that some level of standardization was necessary. The leadership of Meiji Japan, however, were never the type to leave these things to chance and decreed that standard Japanese would be government enforced and based on Tokyo dialect. That's not unusual for the period. Other countries enforced similar decrees, which is why standard Chinese is based on Beijing dialect, standard French is Parisian, and so on. The telegraph system was one of the ways standardization was enforced, and given its limited scope at the time, not the most effective one compared to, say, a school system that operated only in standard Japanese. Other forms of communication we're going to look at in subsequent weeks would drive this process of linguistic standardization forward, but the process begins with the telegraph, so I want to note it here. And speaking of other technologies, there's one other one I wanted to introduce today. It's a bit harder to say who's responsible for it, because the question of credit for inventing this particular bit of technology was almost immediately wrapped up in countless lawsuits and countersuits and patent battles. But honestly, that's all beside the point. What really matters for us is that the telephone was a pretty revolutionary piece of technology. Telephones work, of course, by transmitting sound over wires using electrical current. Older mechanical and acoustical designs existed as far back as the 7th century CE in Peru. These operate on more or less the same principle as the tin can phone you can make by connecting two cups with a taut string. These devices, however, have pretty limited range. Electric telephones are far more efficient at transmitting sound over distances. Simply put, they work by using a receiver to convert sound waves into electrical pulses of varying strength, which are then transmitted down a wire and decoded by a speaker on the other end. And as I already hinted at, it's pretty hard to say who actually invented this first. Credit for the invention is disputed between the Scottish-born Alexander Graham Bell, the American-born inventor Elisha Gray, and the Italian-American Antonio Meucci. Unless, of course, you are my high school Italian teacher, in which case it was obviously Antonio Meucci and the whole thing is an elaborate conspiracy to defame the people of Italy and deprive them of their God-earned credit for one of their glorious accomplishments. For our purposes, and I'm sorry to say this, Signora Capabianca, but it doesn't really matter who invented the telephone, just that by the mid-1870s, a few different prototypes of electric telephones were floating around. And it did not take very long for one of those prototypes to make its way to Japan. The first domestically produced Japanese phone was manufactured in 1878 by the Kobusho, or Ministry of Industry. One of the first testers of the device is reported to have said, quote, "Oh, it's just like hearing the voice of a ghost." However, despite that impressive, if spooky, endorsement, phones were not quick to catch on in Japan. The first proper phone line in the country, between Tokyo and Atsumi, was not constructed until 1890, meaning that Japan was actually a pretty late entrant to the telephone game, behind countries like Thailand, Romania, and Chile. There's no clearly articulated reason why it took the Meiji government a while to invest in this new, seemingly pretty obviously useful piece of technology, but we have a few good guesses. For one, the sound quality of the earliest telephones was frankly pretty awful. It took a few years to really get them to a properly usable state. For another, the telegraph network had a baked-in advantage. It was already well on its way to being set up by the time phones were introduced to Japan, and despite their novelty, phones didn't really offer that much more actual utility, at least at first. Police and government-backed businesses made use of it, but that was about it, at least at first. Still, by 1890, the technology had advanced enough that the Ministry of Industry decided to set up the first public phone network in Japan for the city of Tokyo. And the results of this bold and new step into the future were absolutely abysmal. Only 74 people signed up. And when the government tried to boost numbers with a PR campaign that reached out to over 800 journalists, celebrities, and other public figures, only 23 more people decided to embrace this revolutionary new technology. Of course, there is some context for those low numbers. At the time, Tokyo was in the midst of a cholera epidemic, and as a result, people were somewhat hesitant to let strangers into their home to install these new devices. Plus, a rumor was flying around the city that telephone wires could transmit the deadly disease. Still, eventually interest did start to pick up. By 1893, an Osaka to Kobe phone line was set up, and by 1898, an Osaka-Tokyo line had been established. By 1902, there were 42 telephone exchanges around the country, and over 35,000 people had subscribed to the phone system. Though in a country of around 46 million people, that did represent a pretty small overall percentage of the population, around 0.76% if I'm doing my math correctly. One imagines that for those who did have it, the telephone was a symbol of novelty, innovation, and the technological cutting edge. Still, even in those early days, you can see complaints about the other thing phones would come to represent: a constant source of distraction. The Meiji period writer Natsume Soseki wrote of his phone, quote, "I bought a phone because I needed it to make calls, but I have no use for the calls that are made to me." One of his disciples, Uchida Hyakken, would later recall that Soseki wrapped his phone in gauze to prevent the ringer from making noise, and he found it distracting whenever anyone tried to call him while he was working. Quote, "When he first got it, he just left the receiver off the hook, but the people at the telephone exchange made a big stink about that, so he simply rigged the phone not to ring even when somebody called," unquote. Still, this was only the percentage of the population with a phone in their home. If you're younger than a certain age, you may not realize this, but once upon a time, public phones were also a thing. Phone booths were still a ways away, but public phone offices where anyone could make a call were a fixture of many cities by the late 1890s. The costs were high, but not necessarily prohibitive. A call within Tokyo cost 5 sen, and one to nearby Yokohama about 15 sen, so around the same cost as a telegram, maybe slightly more expensive. Converting that into numbers based on cost of living is, of course, quite a bit more challenging, but if you're a well-to-do city dweller, that's pretty manageable. And things only got more affordable with the introduction of actual public phone booths of 1901. Originally, these were called Jidou Denwa, or automatic phones, because you didn't have to deal with an attendant to use one, just put the requisite fee directly into the coin slot. There was even a highly complicated system of yobidashi denwa, or telephone summons, for two people who wanted to talk to each other without either of them owning phones. The system, set up by the Communications Ministry in 1900, required an interested party to go to the telephone office to ask to set up a call. The clerk there would then call the exchange office for the telephone system, which would then connect to the office nearest wherever the intended recipient was. That office would then issue a yobidashi tsuwaken, or telephone summons ticket, which was then delivered to the intended recipient's house. That ticket was valid for several days. Sometimes they came with a set appointment time for the call, but for others you'd simply have to show up at your office and wait until the original office summoned the person who tried to call you in the first place. The whole thing was monstrously complicated and time-consuming, particularly compared to just sending a telegram. But the novelty of actually getting to talk to people was such that it saw some pretty serious use. 6,600 such calls were placed in the first year the system was available. By 1935, that number rose to 2.26 million. As those numbers might suggest, telephone calls were rapidly growing in popularity during the early decades of the 20th century. Indeed, the main thing slowing down the pace of adoption of home phones by the later decades of Imperial Japan was not interest, but infrastructure. The construction of new telephone exchanges where operators would route calls between two numbers simply could not keep pace with the number of interested callers. As one newspaper editorial from 1918 put it, quote, "Recently telephone exchange service has become particularly unacceptable. A call that, as a general rule, should take 8 seconds to go through can take 10 minutes, even 20, from the time one rings an operator. A call that only takes 20 to 30 seconds to go through is on the fast side." The numbers back this up. By the third decade of the 20th century, a telephone operator, more often than not a young woman between the age of 14 and 25, would be expected to handle between 270 and 280 call routings in 1 hour. If you're unsure what I mean by routing a call because you've never seen an old-style switchboard, basically, whenever you placed a call under this system, you would have to talk to an operator and give them the number you were trying to reach. They'd then manually connect a wire between your line and the line you were calling. These manual exchanges have, of course, since been replaced by automatic electronic ones, but back in the day, that's how every call was routed. Those operators, by the way, are generally the ones credited with introducing the standard response when answering a phone call, moshi moshi. Now, so far as I know, nobody actually knows for sure where that phrase comes from, but the commonly accepted conjecture is that it is derived from mosu, the humble form of to speak, meaning the operator is prompting whoever called to speak and tell them who to connect to. So imagine you're a telephone operator during this time period. You have to start the call, moshi moshi, and then figure out who you're connecting your line to and manually make that connection and do it 270 times in the course of a single hour. And an experienced operator might be expected to handle as many as 350 calls in an hour during peak hours. The writer Tanizaki Junichiro once sardonically remarked of the system that, quote, "Calling from Yokohama to Tokyo took half a day, long enough to go to Tokyo and come back. Actually, it really was just faster to go to Tokyo and come back." And all of this reveals something interesting, I think, about the history of technology in Japan, or really just in general. Even today, the rhetoric we hear about technology is that it is all about convenience. It's going to save time, make our lives more efficient, all that jazz. But the system was not really efficient at all when it came to telephones in Japan. For the first few decades of their existence, the system was just plain outclassed by telegrams and even by snail mail. In Tokyo, the mail was delivered 10 times a day, meaning a letter could realistically cross the city within just a few hours and get there faster than a phone call could go through the exchange system. And that wasn't even accounting for the fact that most people in the country didn't even have access to telephones. The system didn't even get routed into rural areas until the 1950s, when the post-war government came under pressure to extend modern technological infrastructure into the countryside in order to win rural votes. This despite the fact that until the middle of the 20th century, Japan's population was primarily rural, not urban. And yet people flocked to use this new technology, literally to the point of creating bottlenecks in the exchange system. And that, I think, raises a very interesting question. Do we actually adopt new technology because it's efficient and useful and produces genuine value? Or is there just something about newness, about the cutting edge that is exciting, even if getting the cutting edge to actually, work is kind of a massive pain? Maybe we just like things that are new and shiny and let us do cool stuff like talk to someone far away instantaneously, even if getting the thing to actually work is, well, a bit more trouble than it might actually be worth. Now, I don't want to end this episode without noting one other important aspect of the telegram and telephone network in Japan. Both were government monopolies before the end of the Second World War, managed directly by the state bureaucracy and specifically the communications ministry. Actually, fun fact, during the US occupation of Japan, the American company AT&T managed Japan's telecom network. It wasn't until 1952 that said network was spun off into a state-owned corporation, NTT, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone. Anyway, the fact that the telecom network was a direct part of the state bureaucracy meant that it was linked to the goals of the state itself, including the construction of an overseas empire. In all of its colonies, Japan's government set up telegram stations to connect back to Tokyo. Telephones were a bit rarer simply because of the extra complexity and expense, but all of Japan's colonial outposts had at least some telephone exchanges. The current-day scholar Da-Ching Yang has done some fascinating statistical work on pre-war Japan's telecom system in the Empire, which demonstrates well the extent to which those technologies were a big part of Japanese imperial ambition. For example, proportionately, Korea had about 31% of the population of the Japanese home islands in 1935, but only 10% of the number of telegraph offices and 4% of the number of telephone subscriptions, a marker of both the poverty of the colony relative to the mainland and a comparative lack of interest on the part of government-run communication utilities in ensuring access among colonial subjects. The pattern is pretty consistent as well. You see the same thing in other long-standing colonies like Taiwan, which had about 7% of Japan's population proportionately, but 2% the number of telegraph offices and telephone subscriptions. Yang also found data from two colonial subsidiaries of the Imperial Telecommunications Network, Manchuria Telegraph and Telephone, and North China Telegraph and Telephone, demonstrating the extent to which use of the network was dominated by Japanese rather than local residents. For example, a one-day survey of private, so non-government telegraph traffic in 1939 found that 80% of telegrams were sent by Japanese nationals in Manchuria, who were less than 5% of the overall population. The numbers are not quite as extreme in North China, which never had the same size of Japanese settler population as Manchuria. A 3-day survey by NCTT found in 1940 that 58.4% of telegrams sent and 57% of telegrams received were in Japanese. But those numbers are still massively skewed relative to the size of Japanese population in the area, indicative of a system of privileged access for Japanese residents who were far better off than most of the natives of the colonies. These disparities were even reflected in things like news dispatches on the telegraph system, which vastly privileged information coming from Japan to the colonies rather than the other way around. In 1933, 1,050 press telegrams were sent from Japan to Korea, 1,100 to Taiwan, and over 1,200 to the Japanese colonies in southern Sakhalin. By comparison, press reports going the other way, from colony to colonial power, were very scarce. Sakhalin had the most at 600, presumably because its proximity to the Soviet Union made developments there of particular concern. Korea got only 400, Taiwan 100. All told, the picture that emerges is pretty clear. The telecommunications network existed primarily for the benefit of Japan's colonial ambition, with little to no thought being given to how it served, or did not serve, the non-Japanese population. Which broadly tracks with the history of communication in general. As we discussed at the beginning of the episode, communications technologies are interesting and important in a lot of ways because of how they can serve as vehicles for state power and control. Advances in telecommunications have made it easier than our ancestors could ever have imagined for us to talk to each other. But ease of communication is not always a good thing. It can be, and has been, manipulated for dark purposes. In the end, it really depends on what's being said. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week when we take a look at a somewhat different technology, the history of the record player in Japan.